So yeah, John Kraft asked me to talk a little bit about the 8K video loop we have running on the two 4K televisions out in the UX lab. The funny thing being, of course, it's not actually running at 8K because Windows Media Components can't run anything higher than 4K. So we actually have 2K stretched across, well, for each monitor, so 4K total. But so this is actually a quick demo that I did a couple months ago using some effects that I've built using Quartz Composer. This actually started oh goodness, maybe 2 years ago, when I was hacking around with OpenCL and Quartz Composer. And I'm just going to kind of walk through a very small part of the process. So working in Quartz Composer, it is actually part of the OS X development package. It's all node-based. It's a little intimidating maybe to get started in, but it's actually a lot of fun, and the nodes make it very, very intuitive. Using FxFactory, you can then turn Quartz Composer compositions into After Effects and Premiere plugins, which is what I've actually done here. So I have full access to everything that I've done in Quartz Composer inside of After Effects and can render it out at whatever resolution, whatever frame rate I need, which is pretty powerful. So yeah, I'll just kind of step through some of the things I've done here. And again, this is all going to be pretty high level, I'm afraid, but should be reasonably fun to go through. So for anybody who's worked with nodes, this should be all fairly familiar. You plug stuff in, and it flows from left to right in Quartz. A lot of places, it'll flow top to bottom, bottom to top, whatever. Quartz is purely left to right. And in this case, I'm dealing primarily with non-interactive stuff, so I actually have a lot of parameters published to the top. So any green dot is actually published, which means that you can access it from the root of the composition. And for this effect, it's actually a number of effects piled on top of each other. I'm using OpenCL, so all of this actually does run on the graphics card itself. So it all runs, depending on how many calculations you're doing, in real time. And a number of years ago, I actually built this as a screensaver. So when my computer, puts the displays to sleep, this is typically what's running. And what's happening is I'm generating a cloud of points in OpenCL, then connecting them all into a polygon mesh, and then rendering that mesh multiple ways. So to simplify it, this is my create mesh patch. And then the mesh create, this is the OpenCL kernel. Now, before you get any ideas and think that I know what I'm doing, I don't actually. I found some sources online, and I hacked them until they did what I wanted them to do. So I added a ton of extra settings. I was trying various ways of rotating things around different axes, different transforms, that sort of thing. And I'm using somebody else's, I think this is a Perline noise distribution that's preset to give me the displacement of all of the points. So I'm just looping through an array of points, randomizing their position, rotating them, stuff like that. And the cool thing, the interesting thing is, last month we talked a lot about the real-time renderer. Why am I blanking? Octane, which of course is based all on NVIDIA CUDA technology. Apple right now really only supports ATI because they are pushing OpenCL. OpenCL is not as robust as CUDA, but it is reasonably powerful, and when you can use it in ways like this, it's actually pretty fun. You can't do real-time ray tracing in a cool engine like Octane yet, but hopefully we'll get there eventually. And actually one of the fun things that I was playing around, and ultimately what I was trying to do, I was trying to replicate Plexus. Because we don't have Plexus here, and I wanted to play around with it, so I decided to make my own. Of course, this is not remotely as powerful in that they connect, the ordering of the polygons right now does not control the, the ordering of the polygons does control which polygon it connects to. It's not the distance between the polygons that controls the connections. So instead of doing a completely dynamic mesh, I'm doing a pseudo-dynamic mesh where the points themselves move around, but the connections are always pretty set in stone. So it's just meshing them based on original creation order. I did create a version. I actually used JavaScript to dynamically reorder them based on distance from center, and it was nuts. And it crashed a lot, so I don't do that anymore. So right now, I'm actually just using the distance between the points to control the brightness of the color. And instead of actually turning on lines in between points that are close or points that are far, turning them off, it's actually all shaded. So a point is brighter or darker based on how close it is to its connected points. So I was actually kind of happy with how it turned out, and I'm actually using that brightness to control both the polygon rendering and the line rendering, and there are actually two separate renderings for both of those. And then the points as well. So one of the cool things about Quartz is that you actually have a number of different renderers that you can play with. And this is a world transform, and we'll just drop into here, and here we have a point renderer. So I'm bringing in my mesh. So here we have vertex values, we have the vertices themselves, and then a number of other settings such as resolution scale, so that all of my settings actually scale correctly depending on what resolution I set this to. And so here we have a point renderer. Point renderer just gives me basically sprites at every single vertex. With this, I just added a very slight glow, and then I edited it a couple different times to actually kind of control the fall off of the glow. Now, one of the limitations I found was that it couldn't render sprites more than 128 pixels. So in order to render at like 8K or 16K resolutions, I had to limit the rendering of the point sprites to, say, 2K or 4K, and since they were pretty soft, that wasn't a huge deal. So I just limited that and then scaled it up dynamically inside the line rendering and polygon rendering. So here I just have a simple billboard. Again, Quartz Composer is all based on the graphics card, so all of this is OpenGL based. Billboards, sprites, all very, very standard rendering situations. And another interesting thing with Quartz is that the unit system is completely screen dependent, in which case it means that the width of the screen is always normalized to 2. So you have 0 point in the middle of the screen, and you have -1 to one side, +1 to the other side. And then the vertical is simply a, dependent on whatever your screen size is. So the vertical could be, 0.5, it could be 2 if you have a vertical screen, that sort of thing. But the coordinate system is completely normalized to the width of the screen. So in this case, to render the point sprites, I am rendering them at a width of 2, which means that they simply fill the screen left and right. I can actually show you what the point sprites alone look like by plugging that in. So that's what the points look like. So I'm simply rendering them in the background and then rendering all of the lines and polygons on top of that. So here's my renderer for the lines and for the polygons. One interesting thing here is that I actually have an anti-aliasing switch. So if I uncheck that, it runs a lot faster, but you can see it's pretty chunky. Enabling anti-aliasing, I'm actually using the, and I can't even read that, iterator, there we go. I'm actually using the iterator to render every single line a whole bunch of times. In this case, I'm rendering 21 iterations of every single line. And then I'm using actually a 21 sample JavaScript that I wrote to give me an array of lines. That array is basically brute force multi-sampling. So instead of rendering at double the res and scaling it down to get clean output, I'm actually rendering it 21 times to the screen. And that's actually faster than trying to render larger and then scaling it down in some cases. Because this is all OpenGL, the resolution is sometimes actually the limiting factor, not the number of polygons that you have on screen. I only have about 64 polygons, so multiply that by 21, multiply that by 2, because I have both the flat shaded and then I have the lines. And so this was actually the faster way of getting really clean lines. And I actually put all of this together last year when we decided we wanted to do some print resolution stuff. and I was actually able to save out print resolution 8K or 16K textures out of Quartz Composer directly, which was actually quite a lot of fun. So, and I know this is a terrible tutorial for how to actually use Quartz Composer, but it's just a very broad introduction to how this project was built in Quartz Composer.
How did you come to 21 being the number of samples?
I honestly can't remember. I think I was drawing out a matrix of the pixel samples that I wanted, and for whatever reason, 21 was the number I ended up with. I think I had a version that was 7 as well, but 21 gave me the better quality.
So what is like the typical like real world usage for Quartz Composer?
That's a very good question. Apple is very slowly killing it off, to be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, which is very sad and very painful. A lot of VJs have actually used Quartz Composer in the past. I know on the Windows side we have like VVVV, and there are a couple others as well. Quartz Composer, though, is free and very accessible for any Mac user, which has made it actually kind of popular in some places, but it's always been a very niche market. In the past, Quartz Composer is actually what Apple used to develop all of their image processing. Quartz itself is the underlying graphics system in OS X. So when you have your mail open, the window is rendered as part of the Quartz subsystem in OS X. Now, it's not rendered using Quartz Composer compositions, but Quartz itself is the underlying graphics system in OS X. But when you open up, say, when you first, typically, when somebody gets their first MacBook, they open up Photo Booth and they take a bunch of silly pictures with some of the effects. All of those effects were built in Quartz Composer by Apple. So image processing, you can build screensavers in Quartz, you can build real-time demos. I've actually built some applications using Kineme's Quartz Builder. One of those, let's see here, is actually my normal mapping app.
I've wanted John to talk about this forever.
The normal mapping app will actually take any, and the funny thing is I actually built a series of actions in Photoshop to create normal maps out of photographic textures. The problem was they never looped correctly. So you would have to create the normal map, and then you would have to offset the original image by 50% top and bottom, and then redo it, and then you'd have to manually mask in all of the areas where all of the looping didn't work. So this is actually one of the cool things about Quartz is that you actually have a subset of GLSL image processing in Quartz, which means that you can write your own image kernels in Quartz surprisingly easily. And so basically using a series of blurs and a bunch of combinations and subtractions and stuff, I was able to build this. So it'll take any tiled image texture and build a normal map out of it. So, I mean, the first step is you can kind of mix channels. So I built in a channel mixer. So you can control exactly the height data that's being generated. You also have, very basic brightness, contrast controls. It's all Hermite spline based, so you never, you can clip data, but it's built so it's a little bit more difficult to actually clip data. And then you can mix the strength of the map. You can control how details are handled, the scale of the details, and then kind of the shape as well, how flat or how bumpy it is. And then it gives you a real-time preview with the color map as well.
That's just a photo you...
Yep. Yeah, this photo is actually downloaded from cgtextures.com. Very easy source for getting pre-tiled textures.
Yeah.
I use it a lot. I used to try to build everything procedurally, and then I decided but I could do it faster with photos. So then this is now how I build a lot of my textures for 3D. And this entire system is actually built in Quartz, including all of these sliders. So all of the mouse interaction, all of this I built from scratch in Quartz. Because you can get full mouse data, and then I wrote a bunch of JavaScript to control all of the sliders. And so if I want to, I can just right-click on any slider and it resets it to the default. So you can right-click on anything. Yeah, this is your version. I'm sorry, you don't have this version. So I actually kind of want to rebuild it a little bit. There's a new program being developed right now by Kineme. Kineme.net was one of the primary sources for getting additional paid plugins for Quartz Composer. They wrote a lot of 3D plugins and a lot of other stuff, such as Quartz Builder, which is what I use to turn a Quartz composition into a standalone application. Yeah, and then if I click Save, saves it out, and then on my desktop, whoops, I will have two new images. I will have the final depth map and then the normal map. This was built using some of the Kineme plugins. Anyway, Kineme, as a company, they've actually spun off a new product called Vuo, which they are targeting to actually replace Quartz. The downside being it's actually a lot more complicated, much more powerful, but a lot more complicated. I've not really been particularly happy with how they've structured some of it. Hopefully it keeps getting better. The last version I tested, I think it was version 1.0. It was quite a bit more fun to play with than the 0.6 alpha, which was not fun to play with. So eventually, hopefully, we will be able to use Vuo to replace a lot of this. And the plan is for Vuo to eventually also be cross-platform. That's something that Quartz Composer will never be because it's actually built in part of the OS X system. Quartz Composer will never, unfortunately, be cross-platform. That's actually one of the first questions everybody asks me when I try using this for a project here at Vectorform. It's like, well, can't we do this in Windows? No, I'm sorry. This is actually one of the things you literally cannot do in Windows. So that's kind of what you can use Quartz Composer for. It is very limited, and like I said, Apple is slowly killing it off. They really haven't released updates in quite a while. But there are still some places using it. Facebook, for example, uses Quartz to actually create some of their application demos. So when they are developing a new user experience, such as the much hated Messenger app, they actually built the entire thing in Quartz Composer first to demo all of the animations and to test user interactions, that sort of thing. And so I think they call it Origami. Facebook actually released all of their user interface prototyping plugins for free for Quartz Composer. So if you look up Facebook Origami, you can actually download a set of plugins. The last time I did that, it actually crashed it completely. So I haven't used it recently. I'm used to the normal Quartz Composer setup anyway, so it doesn't do me a whole lot of good. But if you're interested in application prototyping, it's actually a pretty cool thing to get into. Once you've built something in Quartz Composer, you can actually open it up in FxFactory. FxFactory is kind of billed as more of a plugin storefront. There are a lot of plugins that you can buy, and FxFactory, run by NoiseIndustries, the company, a lot of different people actually build plugins on this platform, and they sell them for, $60, $100, $200. There's quite a few available. Here at Vectorform, we don't actually use any of them. We use FxFactory only for integrating Quartz Composer into After Effects, Premiere. It'll support Motion, it supports Final Cut Pro X, and a couple others, I think. Right now, we're just using After Effects and Premiere. These are some of the effects that I've actually built for use here at Vectorform. Recently on a video project, we needed a way to swipe between application screens. And so I just built a transition in Premiere so you can apply the transition between two screens and you can swipe between them just as a transition with full control over like how much fade there is between them, full control over how much overlap there is. So as you swipe, you can actually move the screens or you can keep the screen stationary and just swipe. So it's kind of an adjustable effect somewhere between a gradient wipe and an animation control where the two screens simply move across the screen. And it'll do any combination in between, stuff like that. So here's the VF polygons effect, which means that I can open this up in Quartz. There we go. There's my effect. Something to note, I actually did this mostly grayscale because I wanted to color everything in After Effects. One of the pitfalls of using Quartz Composer is that Apple doesn't really give you a whole lot of control over exactly how your image space is handled. It tries to do a lot of that automatically, which automatically ruins it. So be careful about that if you ever use Quartz Composer. Thankfully, FxFactory actually takes care of some of that. So it will try to force it to render in a known image format, so 8-bit, 16-bit, or floating point. Everything inside of Quartz Composer is natively floating point, which is phenomenal. Getting it out of Quartz Composer in floating point is almost impossible. So basically, just as an explanation, blue patches actually render to a screen context. When you're doing image filters, you can actually render out to an image, and depending on how the application integrates the Quartz Composer composition, that's another way of using it. In this case, we're just rendering to a screen context. So what happens is FxFactory creates this screen context, takes the image inputs from After Effects, renders it on the graphics card, and then the screen context is captured by FxFactory and then reintegrated back into After Effects. It's all handled completely seamlessly. You never know that's what's happening. And there have been some cases where I've actually been able to recreate some of the After Effects plugins and get them to render like twice as fast, just because it's all GPU based instead of Adobe, which is slow. There are a lot of options. In this case, I've enabled 16-bit and floating point support for this plugin. So it will render at full floating point quality in After Effects, which is pretty awesome. And I mentioned earlier that the green dots on the input ports are published. This is where they get published to. So in this case, I can select what kind of image I'm rendering. One of the fun things about this when I was developing the OpenCL code is that I figured out how to UV map in real time. This is a cheap projection map, so I'm just taking the X and Y coordinates of the 3D mesh and pushing that to a UV map. But I've also implemented kind of a pseudo projection as well, so I can distort the UV map based on distance from the camera. So in this case, you'll see it kind of goes in between a visible logo and a non-visible logo, where it just kind of falls completely apart. And what I'm doing is a low-frequency oscillation. It's just a sine wave that controls this. So the live UV mapping is projecting this image through the mesh. The mesh renders it, and then I'm controlling how much perspective distortion is visible. So, image selection, I have preset images, or you can select a custom image, in which case you can actually take any texture in After Effects and project it through the mesh. And then UV distortion is just a simple slider, minimum value, -1, maximum value, +1. So again, this is just a very high-level overview of how all of this was built. Once you get familiar with it, it's typically pretty easy to work with. The evolution controls, again, just published to After Effects. You can animate it with time or however you want. Yeah, and then I have some basic 3D positional, rotational controls as well. I can turn on or off uniform scaling. Of course, anti-aliasing. If you're trying to work and render in After Effects, it probably runs a little bit slower. This is actually a pretty complex setup, so it does unfortunately render a little bit slower, so you can turn off anti-aliasing and just render a lot faster. And then just basic stylistic things like the scale of the line and point. When I started doing the 8K loop, it turns out the lines will automatically scale, but they only render at pixel increments, not sub-pixel increments. And so right now I have it set up so it will up the pixel increment every time you increase the resolution of the output. But it wasn't quite where I wanted it, so the line scale was an easy way of controlling that and just kind of scaling that back a little bit because the lines were a little bit too thick by the end. So yeah, that's FxFactory, and then once we get into After Effects, let's see here, let's go with this one.
Interested for John both at lunch break. So.
The plugin itself did take about that long. Because I built a lot of that already for print, and so I had the Quartz composition ready to go. Turning it into a plugin for After Effects using FxFactory really did take maybe an hour at most.
How are we working with Quartz?
So I wasn't kidding.
So in this case, I decided to kind of break things down a little bit. I knew I wanted to make use of both monitors. We actually went through a number of tests on this. Because the monitors have the bezel in between, I needed to incorporate a gap between the monitors. In the end, it turns out it was actually a lot better to just turn on SLA and connect the two graphics cards controlling the 4K monitors. We have two high-power graphics cards in that system. Once we connected them, we could just treat the display as a single display and incorporate an automatic 68-pixel gap in between. I had no clue that was possible, but thankfully some of our developers here use Windows, so they got that figured out. It's fantastic. What I did was I just broke this up into different elements that I wanted. So I animated the different elements in and out, and of course because I wanted it to loop, just having the elements fade in and out, I was able to then compile them all together into a seamless loop. And I incorporated some lens blur to add some tilt shift effects, stuff like that. And by the end, then we had the logo loop. So you'll see when I select this, and oh my goodness, everything's ruined.
Did you use the, did you use custom headphones or the JJ?
How about the flares?
I actually used optical flares for the first test I did. Why can't I? Oh, come on. Fine. So you'll see all of those published inputs in Quartz. I have full control of here. So the evolution, I set up just with a quick expression. So it's based on time plus the offset of my manual evolution, which was a super simple way to get the polygon look that I wanted because it's completely randomized. I just kind of cycled through time till I found a look that I liked, and then I just added in a scaled time value as well. So then it would just slowly animate. Then I animated position, rotation, stuff like that. And let's see here. Let's go back here. Sorry, my setup is definitely built for two monitors, not one. I compiled all of these. I set up my center point so I would know where it was fully visible. And then for any elements that I wanted to loop around, I simply duplicated the element and then offset it by the exact amount of time. So that way, as it comes in at the exact point that it goes out. So that was a super easy way to go ahead and loop everything. And since I had all of the elements built that way, it was really easy to just layer everything additive. None of this is, super complex visually. I added a tritone effect to control all of the tinting. So, yep, super basic. So without that, of course, it's just the grayscale. And then I added Magic Bullet Looks. And unfortunately, Magic Bullet Looks was not happy with some of these things. Unfortunately, a lot of like the pop effect does not render over 4K. I've had really major issues with rendering some of the skin effects like Cosmo at over 4K as well. Just recently, I was finally able to get it to work in Photoshop at over 4K, but only just barely. So let's see here. Do I have any other effects? I guess that's just it. Unless I was able to get it to work this time. I didn't think so. Oh, hey, it is working this time. Okay, so apparently the most recent version is working. Last year I was having issues with Magic Bullet Looks. Now it's perfectly fine and everyone loves it. So yeah, in this case, I just wanted to add a little bit more chrominance depth to the imagery. So I'm doing the typical blue and yellow split in the color ranges. So highlights are warmed up a little bit, midtones are a little bit redder, and then shadows are very cyan. So it adds just a little bit more depth to the color. I'm also adding just a touch of diffusion, so really bright areas start to glow just a little bit of a reddish pink, just a tiny bit of haze flare to fill in some of the shadows. I'm not using chromatic aberration, that was just a silly addition that I should never have done. And then I'm also using some auto shoulder just to tone down some of the really bright areas, and then adding film grain to break up some of the banding that we were getting. I am rendering this, I think, at 16-bit now, so it's rendering fairly well, but the film grain just kind of helps break it up a little bit more. So that was my process for building an 8K video loop.
Which you can see in front.
Yep. Yep. I don't know if there are any questions or complaints about how boring this was, but
Way above my head, but it was awesome.
cool.
So should people learn Quartz because it's dying, or should they
That's-
try to learn Vuo if they haven't?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, I'm still using Quartz because I've used this for a couple of years now. It's pretty powerful. There are a ton of things that I can do in Quartz that I cannot pull off in After Effects. And there are a lot of things that I can pull off in Quartz that I cannot pull off in After Effects efficiently. So, like in a lot of cases, you want to be able to, create a mask and then blur something based on that mask and that sort of thing, and you just end up with pre-comps everywhere, and it's a nightmare. Whereas if I build it with nodes in Quartz, the power of nodes being that you can just plug in, those multiple inputs into multiple outputs and take care of all of that automatically. And then I publish that as a plugin, and then in After Effects, I just have my input, and then it renders what I want it to render. It's fantastic. And it's just a lot more efficient in a lot of cases. Sometimes, yeah. And then in some cases, yeah, it's just, I'm able to do things in Quartz that I just cannot do in After Effects. I've built some like cartooning effects that were a lot of fun to build using kind of like I think it was a Crimin style despeckle effect. And I was actually able to get a lot higher quality out of that than I was able to do it using the effects found in After Effects. And then it rendered twice as fast. Unfortunately, I can't really recommend people to learn, like devote a huge amount of time learning Quartz. If you have time and you want to play around with it and nodes typically make sense to you, then go for it. It's a lot of fun, and you get real-time feedback, which is a huge amount of fun. So, you can hook up your mouse input to a glow factor and then move your mouse around, and the glow changes because you're moving your mouse. And it's just a very immediate way to develop things, which is a lot of fun. But unfortunately, like if you're strapped for time and you're wondering if Quartz is going to be a good tool set, unfortunately, I can't really say that's the case. Apple hasn't updated it in a long time. It used to be that you could use Quartz compositions directly in iMovie, because the effects that you could use in Photo Booth were the same ones you could use in iMovie. Because Apple is making iMovie strictly compatible with iOS, all of that is now broken. So you can no longer use Quartz compositions in iMovie. So last month, one of the guys here asked for the Mograph team to look into ways where we could templatize a lot of our motion graphics, so that the sales team could record a video on their phone and then put the motion graphics on top and send it out to a client. Unfortunately, the answer was we can't do that anymore because iMovie no longer does that. We can build these things in Quartz Composer, and I ended up recreating all of our motion graphics inside of Quartz Composer. Now, the cool thing is now we can actually render that on the server side. So our salespeople, hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll get this developed by the dev team. Our salespeople will be able to upload a video from their phone to a server. The server will automatically render all of the pre-roll credits, render the dynamic lower third with whatever text they give it, render out the closing motion graphics, render it to a file, compress it, and then display it online. So using Quartz, we can actually automate that entire process, which is pretty spectacular. But again, Apple's trying to kill it off, it seems. So we're all kind of looking for other solutions that we may be able to eventually migrate to, which is why Vuo is one of the options that I've been personally following for the past couple of years. You can find out more about that at vuo.org. We can include those notes in the meeting notes. And yeah.
What are you guys shooting on your phones? Is that asking too much?
I'm sorry?
What is Vectorform shooting on their phones and producing?
The video team at Vectorform doesn't do anything like that. The sales team wants to be able to send very quick messages. They've seen really great sales response, especially at other companies. where you're able to send very quick messages to clients and just give them a face-to-face update instead of just a long email. Because it's more engaging, the client feels like we're paying more attention to them, that sort of thing. And so they're looking for a way to automate that and then make that as simple for the sales team as possible. So Rachel, yes, Rachel has actually created a presentation for the sales team to guide them on how best to shoot video on their phones. Like, be careful about what's in the background. You don't want it to be too busy. You don't want it to be too boring. Don't shoot it against a window because you're going to turn into a silhouette. Stuff like that.
Tell them to shoot it sideways.
Yes. Always shoot it sideways.
We were doing that all. We're trying to educate everyone else.
Yeah. So as a video team, right now we're last year we shot a ton of stuff in 4K on the Panasonic GH4. This month we've shot a bunch of stuff on Canon DSLRs. So, but typically we're shooting everything on DSLRs. Yes. so yeah. I'm sorry, I tend to go off on tangents.
It seems like
Talk very quickly.
It seems like a lot of that stuff you were showing was Java based as far as like what sort of programming language was there.
OpenCL, it's similar in syntax to JavaScript. It's not. Quartz Composer can use OpenCL. The image kernels are all a subset of GLSL. But how the kernels are run, it uses a JavaScript similar syntax as well. And then it can use actual JavaScript as well, and I used to do a ton of JavaScript development back when I did websites years and years ago. So I'm passably familiar with very basic JavaScript, which made it pretty easy to migrate to Quartz Composer programming as well. I think there might be one or two other languages that you can use in Quartz Composer as well. But you can build things without any coding whatsoever. You can literally just plug one thing into the mix as well. You have an image, you plug it into a blur node, you plug the blur node into an output node, and now the image is blurred, and that's all you need. So programming in Quartz is unnecessary until you want to build your own blur that uses a hash algorithm, so it's much faster. One of our applications for Chrysler, actually the Chrysler 200 app for iPad, we have a dynamic blur. So as you swipe between menus, the background image blurs out and then transforms into the next background image. That blur I actually prototyped in Quartz and then took all of the GLSL code and gave it to the developer. He integrated it into iOS and used it directly in the app.